My name is John Pfeffer. I'm the Director of Foreign Policy in Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies, and I'm also the Director of Global Just Transition. And it's Global Just Transition, along with the Western Mining Action Network, which is sponsoring this event. We're doing several sessions looking at rare earth elements and strategic or critical minerals and the role they're playing in economics, in science, technology, and in the military. We will send a note out to you after the session is over. It'll include the video link, and it will also include an opportunity for you to sign up if you're interested in other events in this series. I'd like to welcome everybody, especially folks from the Western Mining Action Network who are joining us today, and everyone else who's joining from elsewhere around the world. I want to introduce our speaker today, Debamanyu Das. And Debamanyu is a doctoral student in the economics department at UMass Amherst in Amherst, Massachusetts. And he's going to be talking about the geopolitics of strategic minerals. That is the focus of his research at the moment. And while he is speaking, I am going to put some of the references to some of the more technical information that he's going to refer to. I'll put that into the chat for you to follow up on if you're interested. And I believe the chat's been enabled for everybody if you want to use that to make comments. But if you have questions I would really ask you to, chat says disabled. That is unfortunate. Okay, well, I'm gonna, after I get off and Debamanyu starts, I'm gonna go and see if I can enable chat. But in the meantime, if you have questions, please put them in Q&A and we'll take care of them. Debamanyu will talk for about 25 minutes to a half an hour, and then we'll have about a half an hour for Q&A. So thank you again, Debamanyu, for joining us today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, John. Thank you, Institute for Policy Studies, for this opportunity. Thank you for everyone for joining in. Today, I am thrilled by this opportunity to speak on the geopolitics of critical minerals. Let me first start by sharing the slide. I'm hoping that you all can see my slide. So first, let me give a brief context. We all know that the climate crisis is unfolding itself as the biggest existential threat to life on planet Earth, and so are the efforts towards green transition. Now, this transition depends on the continued availability and the use of certain critical minerals as raw materials for renewable energy, electric vehicles, energy storage, and similar low-carbon technologies. For instance, lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, and rare earths would be used to fuel batteries of electric vehicles, while rare earths like neodymium, dysprosium would be essential for permanent magnets used in wind turbines. Now, these critical mineral mining activities are spread all across the world, particularly in countries of the global south. However, refining and processing of these minerals are primarily concentrated in China. So today, in my talk, one of the central themes will be on the idea of concentration surrounding these minerals. Another major theme will be to bring the contexts from these global south. So most discussions pertaining to geopolitics of critical minerals so far is generally concentrated around China, US, and the Europe. In today's presentation, I will also like to engage with the issues which are being faced by countries in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, and what can be done to achieve not only a sustainable transition, but also a just one. So first, let me go into the keywords: geopolitics of critical minerals. So geopolitics. Why do we care about geopolitics? Let me here start by a brief history of geopolitics. The idea is for my audience to see if we can draw parallels with today's context. So the term geopolitics was coined by the Swedish political scientist Rudolf Gelin in 1899. For Gelin and other imperialist thinkers of that era, geopolitics was essentially a kind of a deterministic relationship between geography and politics. In its imperial form, geopolitics is a form of power concerned with promoting state expansionism and securing empires. This relates directly to rivalry between nations, a territorial expansion, and military strategies in order to obtain that goal. During the World War, in the context of Nazi Germany, it changed its context when it started to be associated with the foreign policy goal of Lebensraum. So what is that policy? It's the idea that Germany should expand at the expense of inferior states to secure more living space for itself. During the final years of Cold War, this term geopolitics, it changed once again to describe the tension between Soviet Russia and the United States for influence and control over states and the strategic resources for world. At the dawn of the 21st century, this idea changed to evolving relationships and power struggle between the superpowers US and Europe and a new emerging power from the East, China. So today, in the context of climate change, the term geopolitics covers ecological politics, which relates to the power struggle between nations to get access to these key materials, critical minerals and rare earths, for energy transition. So we noted that this context of geopolitics has evolved over years, with lesser emphasis on determinism and more emphasis on strategic importance of natural resources, their location, concentration, and constraints which might arise out of it. Here, let me talk a little bit about changing nature of geopolitics from oils to minerals, because that would be important in the coming slides as well. So during the First World War, when warfare became mechanized, there was a shift in British Navy from coal to oil. From that point of time, access to oil has been the most important point, the crucial component of geopolitics, which has dominated the conversation in that particular century. With the growth of car ownership, Western countries started relying more and more heavily on oil imports from the Middle East, and then came the oil crisis shock of the 1970s. So these events necessarily transformed the nature of geopolitics surrounding oil from being a military one to being that of an economic one. Later on, in 2006 and in 2009, the gas disputes between Russia and Ukraine have underscored the importance and concerns regarding transportation infrastructure, pricing power, and supply disruption as geopolitical instruments using energy as a tool. Now, as today's world embraces renewables, and as this transition is going to be extremely mineral intensive, newer challenges will arise. So will newer constraints, which might have future implications for geopolitics. This relates directly to the question about who controls the supply chain of these minerals. So to answer this question, let me use this particular chart, which I have borrowed from the International Energy Agency. If you are familiar with any discussion on critical minerals, then you probably have seen this chart multiple times. It encapsulates beautifully the distribution of critical minerals across all the countries, across different operations. As you can see in this chart, most activities are highly concentrated in China, which brings us to the central theme which I started by, which is concentration. So China is currently the global leader, overwhelmingly controlling the global supply chains associated with critical minerals. For instance, It controls almost 60% of global production of rare earths. For battery production, China controls almost 60% of graphite. In terms of refining, China's share is around 35% for nickel, 50 to 70% for lithium and cobalt, and almost 90% for rare earths elements. So then the essential question becomes, how can we capture concentration and control over resources? Now, the dominant narrative in this picture is it revolves around the idea of ownership. However, I want to underscore the complications surrounding control, ownership, and concentration. A mine might be owned by a particular corporation, but then who controls those corporations? What is the level of control that any particular shareholder could exercise over a company? We need to think of these questions as well. And as academics, we can use different measures to capture control and concentration. John, if you can share the first article, that would be great. So I'm using this particular framework from Gali et al., from Gali's paper, the China, the United States, and competition for resources that enable emerging technologies. Without going into much details, technical details, let me explain what's happening in this particular chart. So one of the measures which the authors are using is called the HHI, Herfindahl-Hirschman Index. It measures concentration, and it's a sum of squares of each producing country's production share, which means how much are they producing. So supposedly, if China is producing a particular mineral, only China is producing, then it would be 100 is the production share, then 100 squares, so that would be 1,000. So more the index, it means that more is the amount of concentration. In this particular case, the author also explored the idea of net import reliance, NIR. So what is net import reliance? It is calculated as a percentage of each country's consumption. So which means that how much a country is importing in order to rely on its consumption. It can range from 0 to 100. 0 means it's a net exporter. 100 means the net imports are required to fulfill all of the country's consumption, which means that the country is not producing anything. So let us take the example of this particular table, which I'm showing over here, this particular chart. Over here, quadrant 1, which is the left side, the bottom left squares, that quadrant 1, it refers to minerals for which neither country, and we are talking here about US and China, this is the quadrant where neither country is import reliant, which means production in these countries exceeds consumption. So there is not going to be a competition between US and China. Now let us talk about quadrant 2. It is in the top left side of the quadrant. So in this quadrant, we can find that United States is highly import reliant. If you see, the net import reliance is more than 50 to 100, which means it's importing a lot of minerals from other countries. Now, what I want you all to note is that China is a top source of imports for 9 out of these 13 critical minerals, which means that US is import reliant on all these minerals from China, which means the dependency on one single country is very, very high. Also, if you look at the colors of these minerals, you will see that they are red, dark red, which means that there is high concentration in these minerals as well. Now, let us quickly try to look at quadrant 3, what's happening over there. Quadrant 3 is located in the bottom right-hand side. So over here, it means China is highly import reliant on all these minerals, but US is not. Surprisingly enough, US is only producing beryllium, which means China can obtain the rest of the minerals from a diverse set of countries. And it is exactly doing that, which means its dependency of China on a single country is relatively low. Now, let me go to quadrant 4, and this is the most interesting case because quadrant 4, it's the top right-hand side. It is that quadrant where neither US nor China are producing those minerals. So both the countries are highly import reliant. Hence, there will be fierce competition between China and the US for grabbing those resources. In this quadrant, we can see minerals like rhodium, tantalum, niobium, and so forth. So niobium, if you can see, it's at the extreme right-hand corner of the top quadrant. So let me talk a little bit about niobium then. Niobium is a mineral, it's a critical mineral which finds its use from wind turbines to jet engines and superconducting magnets. Almost 98% of niobium reserves are found in Brazil, and almost 3/4 of niobium is coming from a company called CBMM. China has been trying for quite some time to gain more and more access to this resource for quite some time. The Chinese state-owned enterprises, they acquired almost 15% stake of the company CBMM in 2011. In 2016, there were 2 additional mines were acquired by China. So the first picture in this slide, it shows signs of mining operations owned by Chinese corporations in Brazil. In the second picture, it's taken from a YouTube video of Bolsonaro from 2016, when he was running for Brazilian presidency. There we find him giving a presentation about a mineral de momento, niobium, mineral of the moment, niobium. So in this video, Bolsonaro, he expressed his outrage over these activities of China. And this is interesting. The idea of using niobium as a tool for resource nationalism, as a weapon of trade war, is interesting in geopolitics. While Bolsonaro didn't end up sanctioning against China or extending any kind of trade bans, these signals can impact economic and trade-related outcomes. And that is exactly another crucial point which I want to underscore. Geopolitics is not just about China's dominance in the market. It's not just about what US or Europe can do in this context. It's also about mineral-rich economies, mineral-rich nations from the global south, their strategies and signals which they might pursue in the context of having abundance of resources. So in the last couple of slides, I discussed this idea of concentration. It turns out that critical mineral industry is highly concentrated. So what are the implications? Why should we care? It means that other countries are more and more dependent on fewer countries, and primarily China. If we look at the figure, which is taken from Financial Times from just 3 days ago, it shows the dominance of China in midstream and downstream operations, like in material processing and in the final product as battery cells. This is particularly with respect to electric vehicles. Which means that there are increased dependencies. Now, why are these dependencies bad? These dependencies can impact mineral-rich nations and the global north nations in different ways. So let me talk a little bit about mineral-rich nations, and then I will go on to other nations as well. So it can result in potential constraints with respect to supply chain arising from lack of infrastructure, from forward linkages like mineral beneficiation and backward linkages with respect to local capabilities and suppliers. One of the major issues which might actually arise in this context is the loss of value-added potential for mineral-rich nations. And I would be happy to talk in details about that in the question and answer session if there is enough interest in this. It means that the mineral-rich nations cannot benefit from linkages starting from job creation to creation of secondary and tertiary industries, because these raw materials are directly sent to China, where all these activities are happening. So this was from the context of global north. But other countries, US, Euro, they can also face bottlenecks in supply chains because of the high concentration in this industry. For instance, in 2010, there was a ban on Chinese export of rare earths to Japan after a fishing dispute. In 2019, there were similar threats of a rare earth ban as a response to the US President Trump's decision to jack up tariffs on the telecom maker, Huawei. The dominant narrative here is that geopolitical implications are coming primarily from China, and I agree it is. But also, I like to emphasize that these constraints might come from mineral-rich nations as well. Congo has a majority of world's known reserves of cobalt, in fact, more than 50%. During 1970s, institutional inefficiency, along with political unrest, resulted in price volatility of cobalt in Congo and disrupted its supply chains. So it means that the cases from Brazil with respect to niobium or Congo with respect to cobalt, it underscores the need to broaden our understanding about the scope of geopolitics. Now that I have discussed the geopolitical implications with respect to supply-related bottlenecks, let me introduce to you the geopolitical, the political economy of this aspect. And John, if you can send the articles in this particular case, there are a lot of articles which I would be citing as an example. That would be great. So the question is whether the geopolitical implications of this transition will result in more conflicts or lesser conflicts as compared to the current situation, which is dependent on fossil fuels. Now, first, let me give you a disclaimer. Though this might seem as a causal question, I will try to answer it in terms of an association or a relation between the two. The process of decarbonizing the global economy will result in certain changes in underlying geopolitical structure of nations. Now, there are at least two contending views regarding this association of this transition on geopolitics. The first group, renewed conflict group, it argues that the transition to renewables will replace traditional fossil fuel exporting countries to become the new drivers of conflict and geopolitical tensions. We can find these kind of arguments in Rothkopf, Raman. I believe the papers are sent. The basic idea of this group is that rents associated with oil and gas production will decrease, leading to a loss of income stream, resulting in more and more conflicts in those regions. On the other hand, the reduced conflict group, it argues that the transition will result in greater energy sufficiency, it will result in an equitable energy distribution and reduced conflicts. We can find Overland Manson's argument to be very similar to that of the reduced conflict group. Additionally, there is also an issue of stranded geopolitical assets. Traditional fossil fuel exporting countries, they might face losses while the mineral-rich nations might actually gain during this shift of power. So there is going to be kind of a power transition. Financial market valuation of fossil fuel corporations would actually have to decline, which would result in countries like Russia ending up with stranded geopolitical assets, a topic which has been discussed once again in Overland and in their book by Chomsky and Pollan. So now that I have discussed the geopolitical implications, let me talk a little bit about what can countries do. I will start with US and domestic policies. Due to its strategic importance of the critical mineral sector and mining, and its increased role in the future of energy market, I argue for a more direct involvement of the state. This will necessitate rethinking the state industrial policies for the US with a more active focus on financial incentives, not only for producers, but also for consumers. This will need, among many other things, redirecting subsidies from, say, the fossil fuel sector to clean energy sector, and thinking about compensation packages for the people who are going to be impacted by this transition. Other forms of financial incentives include tax breaks and tax credits, some of which we have already seen in the most recent Inflation Reduction Act. In this context, the case of Mountain Pass is of particular interest, and if there is interest, I can talk in details about that in the question answer session as well. But this is not enough. Since this transition is going to be extremely mineral intensive, extraction of minerals might not be actually sufficient to meet the final demand after a few years. And there is contending research in this field. Some research says that no, it's going to be enough. Some says that no. It depends on a crucial thing, which is recycling. So we need to ramp up recycling. Currently, recycling rates of critical minerals are extremely low. It's actually less than 1% for certain critical minerals. So there is a need to bridge the gap between academia and policy so that more and more funding is available for research on recycling techniques, on less intensive mining practices, on practices which result in less water usage. There is also a need towards international cooperation in removing technological and research barriers in all these research, starting from mineral exploration to recycling. So now, in the last couple of slides, I will discuss the implications on the Global South. As you can see from this chart, minerals are extracted primarily from Global South. I'm taking the key minerals which are used in electric vehicles for lithium-ion batteries. Lithium, as you can see, is primarily concentrated. The reserves are concentrated in lithium belt, primarily in Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. Cobalt, it's primarily in Congo. Nickel in Indonesia and Brazil, graphite in Turkey, China and Brazil, manganese in Brazil and South Africa. Australia is definitely an important player, but here I'm talking about the Global South's perspective. In this figure, which is taken from the International Energy Agency, we can see the share of minerals and metals in total product exports for mineral producing countries. We can see that the African nations, which are denoted by this greenish turquoise color, we can see that for some countries, it's actually more than 50%, like in Botswana or in Congo. So the question is, what is the impact of this shift of power and geopolitics on mineral-rich nations? One of the concerns is that these nations might end up being prey to the classic resource curse problem. So what is resource curse? In a crux, resource curse means that resource-rich nations can be economic underperformers. And that can happen due to multiple reasons. Historically, there is a tendency in primary commodity exporters to suffer from a decline in terms of trade or experience volatility in prices of raw materials. In the context of critical minerals, since China is controlling the supply chains, and since the prices of most critical minerals are actually not showing any downward trend, it may be safely assumed that it is not going to be the primary reason for resource curse. But resource curse can also arise due to presence of weak oligarchic institutions, leading to inequality and lack of regulations to prevent the elites from capturing the rent associated with the resources. Incentives might emerge for corruption in this presence of poor institutions and reduced government accountability in these economies. Resource extractivism in the past has been associated with rent-seeking behavior, and that can naturally lead to corruption. Now, I'm not saying that these nations or communities in Africa or Latin America, they have to be corrupt. That is definitely not the implication. What I'm saying is that the current model of unfettered natural resource extraction without any accountability or regulation has led to corruption and rent-seeking, which has often hurt the local communities. This can be seen in Congo, for instance, where we can see illegal armed groups have fought for control over mines, exploited miners, and used profits from the minerals to fund their continued violence. In small and artisanal mines where regulation is almost absent, you can imagine how critical mineral mining can aggravate inequality and social problems associated with that. Additionally, there can be disputes from land claims, which have manifested in the form of conflicts in several parts of the globe, starting from Argentina to Guatemala, Peru, Venezuela, and the list is just never ending. We have heard about disputes related to water scarcity and water management. For example, in Chile, where almost 2 million liters of water is required to produce just a ton of lithium. National and multinational corporations have often used their power and money to acquire and appropriate water sources from these indigenous communities almost in perpetuity. On the top of these ongoing resource extractivism, there is also risks of geopolitical meddling by superpower like China, Russia, US, and other advanced European economies. China, for instance, has increasingly made its presence felt outside its border in Africa, Latin America, by policies like Belt and Road initiatives, but also by funding infrastructure projects in these economies. The scramble for resources by these leaders has been an area of major concern in the global South. John, if you can share the link to our paper at this moment, then that would be great. All right. So what is the way forward? What can these countries do? Do these geopolitical implications necessarily have to be bad for these vulnerable communities in the global South? Absolutely no. The goal is to minimize these eco-social impacts and maximize the social welfare from transition. That is the goal as an economist. So over here, I will briefly discuss the role of institutions, states, and communities from various parts of the globe to find ways in which resource can actually end up being a blessing instead of a curse for these economies. How can these economies navigate themselves in the geopolitical tension between the superpowers to benefit from abundance of resources? So let me first start with the role of institutions. Sticking with the case of Congo, we saw how oligarchic and corrupt institutions have adversely impacted the local communities. But now let me take the instance of a different project, the Mutoshi Cobalt pilot in Congo. This is a project which is a partnership between a trading and a logistics company, a mining corporation, a cooperative for artisanal and small-scale miners, and an international NGO pact. This is in direct contrast as opposed to oligarchic institutions which controls mines. So when we replace oligarchic institutions with this kind of cooperative, we find an improvement in child labor, corruption, occupational health, as well as environmental impact. You can find more on this in a paper called Mancini et al. In 2021. John, if you can send that paper, that would be great as well. In a lot of cases, disputes arise from lack of formal arrangements and absence of the state. So the state needs to act as the mediator between private corporations and local communities. Targeted progressive fiscal policies can help in this way to redistribute wealth from corporations to communities by sharing of royalties, conditional cash transfers, creation of commodity funds, and so on. Another tool is a sovereign wealth fund, which can serve as a buffer to smooth economic fluctuations. And once again, I will be happy to elaborate on all these later at the Q&A. But sometimes there can be vested interest even among different state actors, in which cases the institutions might turn out to be predatory and rent-seeking at the cost of local communities. In those cases, we need more active participation of community. My next example is from Salinas Grandes in Argentina, where 33 communities worked together towards addressing issues around free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, and the wider recognition of indigenous communities. They demanded the participation of the state as well as the need for transparency in wage contracts. They drafted a community protocol called the Kachi-Yupi FPIC, which offers a comprehensive list of legal and rights-based framework which apply to indigenous population. You can find more about this particular community in their paper Marchigiani et al. 2020. John, if you can send this paper once again, that would be great. Thank you. So I'm coming to the end of this presentation. So successful stories from these different parts of the world, it suggests that mineral-rich nations in the global south, they can avoid the ill effects of extractivism and be more autonomous and less dependent on the geopolitics played by the leaders. What is needed? Proper regulation, state support, better institutions, and increased participation of the local community. I will end my presentation today by this hope that this transition, which we are also excited about, would be a more sustainable one and a more just one, not only for countries in the global north, but also for the countries in the global south. Thank you.
Thank you, Debamanu. That was fabulous. That was admirably concise as well. And you really raised a lot of extremely important issues. I have a lot of questions, but so do other people. So I'm going to let them go first. I'm going to start with an easy one, or presumably an easy one. And that's from Lee Ford about uranium, because uranium didn't figure in the graph. Do you have anything to say about the concentration of uranium across countries and in terms of corporate control? A lot of people on the Western Mining Action Network are interested in uranium.
Thank you for that question. So let me actually go back to the slide which I discussed and see whether uranium. I'm not seeing uranium over here. So it means that it was kind of left out. It is concentrated. The idea is that, so the basic idea about concentration with respect to any minerals is that not about where is it concentrated, but it is about the implications for the marginalized communities, what's happening to them. So I think that's most important. On the back of my head, I don't know much about the deals about uranium. I'm sorry.
No problem. We might dig up some citations and include that with the material we send out. And as I said, we'll send out a link to this video as well as the citations that were included in the chat that you can look at right now. Let's move on to a question from Hongxiao Lu. She asks, are you aware of any initiatives, alliances, coalitions, et cetera, led by Southern countries to improve resource governance? And you had talked about the importance of governance, for example, safeguarding standards and their bargaining power in the global value chain around pricing, attracting investment to develop local supply chains. Do you think such coalitions, if they exist, would make a difference?
Oh, thank you. That's an excellent question. In terms of these particular communities, I can give the particular instance from the Salinas Grandes, which is in Argentina, as a case study. So these communities, when they were framing their community protocol, they were actually supported by local-based community lawyers in drafting the protocol, as well as Foundation for Environment and Natural Resources, FARN, and natural justice. So there are definitely organizations which actually works on all these issues in the global south. Yes.
Excellent. I mean, when you were talking, it struck me that the potential for a kind of cartel emerging among mineral-rich countries as a possibility. What you talked about, of course, the possibility of stranded assets in the fossil fuel-rich countries, Russia, perhaps Saudi Arabia. Will we see, alongside the stranding of those assets of the old energy system, a new set of cartels emerging to replace OPEC in the new energy reality?
Right. No, it's a fascinating point. Like we have seen that in 1960s and 70s when these cartels happened with respect to the oil producing economies. The nature of oil is different from the nature of critical minerals in the sense that these nature of oil, they are just in those particular countries, so they are more concentrated. Whereas geographically speaking, whereas these minerals, particularly rare earths, they are actually distributed all across the world. The rare earths, the term is a misnomer. It's not rare. It's just extremely difficult to extract it, and China is currently the leader. But coming back to the question on mineral-rich nations, whether they can form cartel or whether what they can do, they can definitely work with one another. They can cooperate with one another to make sure that the deals which they are having with respect to China, or so France or US, that's actually more beneficial for their countries as well. And it's not that if we are shifting our minerals from cobalt to other cobalt from Congo to another countries, we don't necessarily want to see those kind of violence or those kind of rent-seeking activities in those countries at all, like as a substitute. What we would want is kind of a cooperation between these countries, and over their civil society, over their local communities, marginalized communities, they would have to work together. The state government, they also have a huge role in this community. But also, I feel there is a role for ESG issues, environmental and sustainability and governance issues in this particular countries.
Excellent. There was a question in the chat: is the renewed interest in Africa by both China and Russia driven by this energy transition, or is there other interest in Africa? China and Russia are obviously interested in, well, feeding populations, more traditional. I know that there's a lot of Chinese investments in coal, for instance, and old energy in Africa. But how much is the renewed interest in Africa driven by the new these new minerals that are critical to the clean energy transition?
Yeah, thank you again for that question. It's Africa has always been a country which like a continent which has been extremely rich in minerals. So what has happened is that it has deep colonial and imperial legacy associated with that, in which there were imperial powers, there were colonial powers who would actually grab all these minerals or grab all these key resources or even labor. So that was the part of that deal. So it has always been the case. In the 20th century, we have seen interests in Africa to grab mines with respect to steel or with respect to coal, because the raw commodities comes from these countries which are spread across the African continent. Starting from 1990s onwards, when this kind of energy independency started dominating the conversations of China and the US and Europe, we have seen that there has been a scramble of resources in Africa, and there has been a renewed interest, which you correctly pointed out. There has been a renewed interest. We have seen policies like Belt and Road initiatives, where China has essentially funded infrastructure projects, from building bridges to building infrastructure projects like solar power grids in these countries. But what are they getting in return is access to this huge energy market, and also critical minerals and rare earths. So definitely it has increased. This interest in Africa has increased in the last 30 years. And it's going to increase even more because of this green transition.
Excellent. Yes. And part of my research into Latin America, China imported only 1% of Latin American goods back in 20 around 2000, and in 20 years it has gone up to 15%. So an enormous increase in the amount imported. Now, that's not just critical minerals, of course, that includes a lot of different things, but critical minerals, as you pointed out in the case of niobium, is really important in its interest in Latin America. There's a question. Go on, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say we can also see renewed interest of the US and the Euro, because what was happening from the US perspective, at least during the Trump's regime of four years, what we observed was Africa was kind of neglected. In the Biden administration, what we are seeing is that there has been new interest in Africa, where people are, from the top officials, they're actually going to Africa to and that is basically one way in which geopolitics is evolving with respect to Africa.
Excellent. Yes. So there was a question about the difficulty of extracting rare earths so that they are usable. And the questioner said, this might be outside your area of specialty, since you're focused on geopolitics, not necessarily the technology of extraction. But I want to emphasize the importance of the processing of rare earth elements. I mean, for instance, Lynas in Australia ships most of it to Malaysia for processing there, and it's that processing facility in Malaysia that is critical for the actual sales of rare earth elements. So, question about the extraction, and also. You mentioned that for a lot of critical minerals, recycling is below 1%. And so how difficult is it to extract rare earth elements, again, from already manufactured goods?
Yeah, so, the question about recycling is so fascinating, because lithium, I was referencing to lithium about that recycling rate. So, rare earths is spread all across the world, but the way in which it's extracted, that is extremely difficult. And China right now has the materials, it has the technology which is available, in which it can do that with respect to economies of scale. Now, this is pure economics. Let me try to explain to you what's happening over here. A lot of these projects have a long gestation period, which means that from once these minerals are found, and the point when the extraction activity starts, the gap between that two is almost like 16 years, 20 years for some projects, depending on the sites. So China has been working since 1980s towards finishing those processing industries, towards finishing those extraction techniques from different parts of the globe, which other countries have not been able to do so. So China is definitely, like, it has a comparative advantage over other countries with respect to extraction and processing technologies. Now let me come to recycling. How difficult it is. So, it's very simple. Demand and supply imbalances. Initially, recycling rates, like 5 years back or 10 years back, recycling rates were really, really low for most of these minerals. Why? Because lithium has very limited use. It was not used extensively. Right now, we are seeing that this hybrid cars or electric vehicles, they are going more and more popular with all these subsidies which are happening, which means that more and more people will buy that, which means there is going to be more and more demand. As the demand increases for these minerals, there is going to be methods by which we have to extract those minerals in the most cost minimizing way. Right now, recycling rates are low because the cost of recycling is high, because research on that is almost at its nascent stage. So what we need is state funding, direct state funding for recycling, for research on recycling. And once that happens, and it is happening, by the way, because of an increased demand, but we need more. So once that will happen, we will hopefully reach a higher amount of recycling rates. And that is basically the goals of this net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, which is by 2035, we would have to increase recycling rates for these key minerals from 1% to at least like 2-digit numbers.
Excellent, thank you. And to a certain extent, you've answered another question, which was, can we estimate, or are there any estimates of how much we can extract through recycling to meet needs? I mean, lithium, it seems like we have an almost insatiable need moving forward if we were, for instance, to shift over entirely to electric cars, to give one example. But I want to, for our last question, because we do want to wrap up in about 8 minutes, I want to combine two questions, and it's going to be a tough question. Not tough in difficulty, but tough in terms of how big a question it is. And it has to do with kind of state mechanisms, the power of the state to kind of intervene into this this market. And so there are two sides. One is the role of states in nationalizing mines. I mean, what's the trend here? Have there been successful examples of states kind of nationalizing the production or the processing of strategic minerals in order to have greater control over that, especially with relationship to kind of the other corporations perhaps that have so much control over this right at the moment? And the second comes from another questioner, and that is a country like Zimbabwe actually banning exports of raw lithium, another kind of lever that a state has at its disposal to intervene in this process. So what's your kind of evaluation as we come to the end of this presentation of the state's role in this regard?
That's a fascinating question. So, it's the state's role, first of all, it has a lot to do, starting from fiscal policies, but also in terms of changing the nature of the relationship between community, corporation, and the state. What we think about it, there is a need to change that idea. On the question of nationalizing mines, let me give you this particular idea, which is there from resource extractivism. So, there are certain countries in Latin America, in Africa. I'm thinking about Latin American countries like Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, who have found themselves in increasingly relying on neo-extractivism, which is this idea that using the proceeds from these corporations to promote national interest. And that is exactly in contrast with predatory extractionism, which is without any transformative agenda. What has happened in both predatory as well as neo-extractivist ideas is that there still has been destruction of communities, there still has been destruction of environment, social and political unrest. What we need is the state to be a mediator between communities and corporations. So that is one. That is the one thing which the state can do. In terms of state support, because this is a critical industry, this is of strategic importance. These industries, they can't be left on its own. We can't leave it to market forces in a market economy like the US. We have to understand why is China a superpower in this case, because Chinese state has funded these corporations, has funded producers as well as consumers, decades. So what we need is the state has to provide active role. And I mentioned briefly about the case of Mountain Pass in California. So let me use that particular example. So Mountain Pass, for the later half of the 20th century, it used to be the world's almost main supplier of rare earth elements. In 1980s and 1990s, the Chinese market, it started dominating this market for rare earths. And that was driven by government subsidies, low worker wages, low environmental standards, and a lot of other reasons. Now, what happened was that Mountain Pass, it lost its competitiveness with respect to China. And in 2002, it was closed after a toxic waste spill. In 2008, it was acquired by Molycorp Minerals. And even after acquiring, what was happening was that it was unprofitable for a lot of years. It actually filed for bankruptcy in 2015. There were attempts by different corporations to revive Mountain Pass. It completely failed till 2020, when there was a $10 million investment from Pentagon. And only then Mountain Pass started becoming profitable. So what I'm trying to say by this example is that these kind of corporations, or just a mining site, if we leave them just to the market forces of demand and supply, it wouldn't work. What is necessary over here is active state intervention. And by active state intervention, I mean state support. So state can help in these two ways. One is help to these corporations, help with respect to funding for projects, funding for projects on recycling, on research, on processing techniques, but also, more importantly, a help for marginalized communities, vulnerable communities who are going to be impacted by this transition. So yeah, does that answer your very interesting question?
Well, those, I hope that answered the questions that our audience have put forward. There were a couple of more questions. Unfortunately, we're coming up to 6 o'clock. So I'm going to say that in future sessions, we're going to cover other aspects of rare earth elements and critical minerals. One, of course, is the role of the Pentagon and other military institutions. Devamanu mentioned, of course, the Pentagon bailout, if you will, of the Mountain Pass mine. We'll be looking at international governance questions, including the United Nations. Someone said, how come you didn't talk about the UN? Well, we'll talk about the UN, don't worry. Questions of compensation. I mean, that is an issue that certainly the Western Mining Action Network has been doing work on. Also looking at the impacts on indigenous lands in the United States, Canada, and elsewhere. And an interesting question that came up, which I think will be provocative to look at in the future, is you mentioned, Devamanu, stranded assets of the old energy system. We could be looking at stranded assets of the new energy system too. If we have new technologies, new batteries, we don't need lithium any longer. All of this investment goes into extracting lithium, and we don't need lithium any longer. Well, we'll probably still need it for other purposes, but there is a potential for stranded assets if we are developing new technologies that allow us to perhaps reduce our dependency on certain strategic minerals and perhaps on extracted minerals overall. That would, of course, be something we are really looking to do. Any final thoughts before we finish up here, Devamanu?
No, it was incredible. This area is so nascent. It's like there are so many complications and there are so many interesting things which are always going to come up. So I'm looking forward to all the next upcoming sessions, which actually would discuss all these things. And thank you for this opportunity.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. You got a lot of excellent feedback in the chat and in the Q&A. I alert folks to take a look at the chat. There's another session on April 12th with Mining Watch Canada, Jamie Neen, on transition minerals. So I want to thank you all. I'll be in touch with you all with a link to this. And we will continue to raise these questions. And of course, we will have you back as well, Devamanu, when you're done with your research and have more conclusions to share with you. So I really want to thank you so much for joining us and sharing that information with us.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.